ship owner, a politician, and a journalist walk into a bar. They start talking about the world's many problems. The ship owner turns to the group and shocks his friends by saying, "I'm an optimist." "Then why do you look so worried?" asks the politician. To which the ship owner simply replies, "What, you think it's easy to be an optimist?" Okay, so it wasn't a bar, and there were significantly more than 3 of them. But once a year, an industry alliance of first movers and green investors gather in a room for shipping's answer to Davos, the annual Global Maritime Forum. And it's always an interesting conversation. Fewer jokes, but interesting. These are shipping's optimists, the progressive cohort of industry leaders who have collectively invested billions of dollars in decarbonisation projects and spawned voluntary projects advancing everything from transparent green finance and insurance to diversity programs and climate-aligned chartering. But it's not easy being an optimist in shipping right now. There's the obvious geopolitical headwinds blowing in, of course, but there's also a growing sense that the industry is in wait-and-see mode right now. Shipping's green first movers are increasingly unlikely to move further without a sufficiently robust regulatory framework from the International Maritime Organization next year. And, scratch below the surface of these conversations about progress and innovation that we're all having, and it's increasingly apparent that we're not yet at a stage where, even without the regulation, that the industry is yet aligned on who ends up footing the bill for what is going to be a very, very expensive transition to green fuels and even basic efficiency investments. And yet, despite all that, when the GMF gathered in Tokyo earlier this month, there was a palpable sense of optimism in the room and genuine evidence that progress is not just possible, it's now inevitable. I'm assuming that most of you listening to this will have attended at one time or another industry conferences where executives talk shop and take a position. The GMF is not really like that. Quite apart from the fact that it's a pretty self-selecting bunch of top-end industry optimists in the room, the focus is very much on progress, on action, and on problem-solving. The collective actions of the several hundred companies and institutions even tangentially engaged in the GMF discussions since 2018, when it first started, have spearheaded and catalysed a pretty dramatic period of change within the industry. But when the GMF started, it was about ambition and sketching out solutions. The 200-plus executives working through the advanced detail of those initial ideas in Tokyo earlier this month, well, they were grappling with the difficult reality of policy implementation that is realistically contingent on political factors that are well outside the industry's influence. And while the progress is real, and it is, this is not a conversation that ignores the challenges yet to be overcome. These may be optimists we're talking about, but they are not unrealistic. So, has the shipping industry really moved from laggard to leader in the race to decarbonise? Well, let me introduce you to a few people first, and then you can make up your own mind on this. Here's Iman Abdallah, Global Operations Director for Cargill's Ocean Transportation Division.
Today, we all believe in the transition. We all believe that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how. Absolutely, we've made that progress. But have we made concrete progress in terms of, on the technology side, yes, we have. I don't think it's also a matter of if we're going to have the right technology for vessels' engines. My biggest question mark on progress is on the molecules. On the green molecules, the green and blue, whatever color, right? The zero emission molecules. To me, that's still a huge question mark, and I don't think it has been addressed. And primarily, it hasn't been addressed because it's not for us as a shipping industry to answer that question. We need a holistic supply chain of zero emission fuels to come together in terms of investments, in terms of infrastructure. And that we have not seen yet. But I've also heard discussions where I know that $8.2 billion of investments have been made in ammonia, and that only equates to 200,000 tons of green ammonia, which isn't enough to fuel 10 vessels. That leads me to believe that in some aspects, yes, we are waiting to see, okay, what's going to happen in terms of regulations and what will be the lowest cost of compliance. Should I make investments in green or blue ammonia or methanol when there is possibly a cheaper compliance option out there? And if there is, why should I be the one to overinvest or overpay?
And that's where we get to the real discussion happening right now, and not just inside the GMF, I should add. The detailed outcome of what happens next at the IMO, the technical and economic measures, the pricing of carbon, whether it's a tax or a levy, all of that is really only just part of the puzzle. Policy will, even in the best case scenario, only bridge part of that cost gap between current fossil fuels and the future zero-emission supply. The rest is a question of commercial arrangements to cover and ideally share the risk of that additional cost. And that's what we're talking about. Despite years of back and forth on this, the fundamental question of who pays for the cost differential of new fuels and more expensive efficiency measures, it's still unresolved. The industry is still trying to justify business cases for efficiency investments based on the cost of conventional fuel now, rather than the more expensive fuels that we all know are coming down the track. But even before we get to discuss the big question of how we split the bill on more expensive fuels, the easy wins, the low-hanging fruit of energy-saving devices and even basic tech like paints and coatings, that's still running into problems.
Today, the question in why we are not accelerating, essentially, the adoption is the discussions that is not taking place necessarily well between ship owners and charterers about the return on investments, which are on fuels basically saving, which most traditionally are paid by the charterer. And that's where we have to have a conversation. So we have started this conversation with the ship owners that we deal with. And we are, as such, then being able to accelerate the adoption of the energy-saving devices. So it's something that I think the industry hasn't necessarily discussed over the past few years, and we're changing this approach.
That's Lloyd Baratkin, head of commercial operations at Rio Tinto. Now, it may seem odd talking about who pays for a relatively cheap, proven technology like paints and coatings, where there's a quick return on investment, and everybody agrees it's a no-brainer in terms of ship efficiency. But that's the problem. We've never really managed to crack the basics, the easy stuff. The economics of the most advanced paints do, by the way, in theory, work out for both charterer and owner. But as Law points out, the charterers do not want to be paying the full cost when other charterers are going to reap the benefit. Owners, meanwhile, complain that the charterers are not being realistic when it comes to investment discussions. So, how do we overcome these issues that, frankly, many of us thought were old conversations?
In first starting with talking about it and finding ways, ultimately, to incentivize and find a fair way to adopt these measures that will make sense both for the charterer and the ship owners. I think the conversation hasn't taken place into going in through the next steps about, okay, how are we going to implement it? More, today was like, oh, I can pay, I'm not having the benefit. So then, oh, I don't want to pay because I've got available vessels, so just focusing, on the rates. So ultimately, we're breaking that. Everybody is sitting on their own camps in basically saying, okay, what are the hurdles or what are actually the pathway to find a way to implement them fairly?
I'll say it again. Taking a detour into paints and coatings when we're talking about a helicopter view of industry-wide progress towards decarbonisation in 2024, well, it's just odd. But the whole theme of collaboration sounds great at the top level and only starts to fall apart when you get into the difficult detail. And that's where we are right now. We're dealing with that difficult detail. Paints and coatings is entirely resolvable. But what about the price differential between marine gas oil and green ammonia, say?
Yeah, that's at least a similar barrier. I'm still wearing the optimistic hat that the measures, will come to life and at a high, let's say, carbon price. So in the realm of the $100, I'm very optimistic. But ultimately, yes, the challenge is definitely to close the gap to the $250 per ton of CO2. And that's where everybody, from our perspective, needs to be able to support the financing. Being, at the ship owner point of view for the optionality, which roughly represent $20 a ton of CO2, plus minus, and maybe supported actually by the banks that are as well, providing competitive interest rates for the financing. Maybe as well also to the shipyards, if they are financed as well, and the shipyards, what can they do? Also to support what will be their future business in terms of retrofitting new vessels, but also developing their capabilities as well in dealing and maintenance, of dealing with these new net zero fuel vessels that will come to their business. So there are the ports as well that we talked about, but as well, the domestic or the regional or national, government, which are today also, looking at developing infrastructure, but also incentivizing the fuel producers to be able to provide different price tags as well to the different sectors that will be using these molecules, be them, ammonia, hydrogen, also methanol or ethanol, and so on and so forth.
That difficult detail, or because of the pause as we wait for regulatory clarity, that this grand project for shipping is somehow stalling. Here's Mathieu de Tugny, Head of Marine and Offshore at Bureau Veritas.
Yes and no. Until now, I think we try to have a vision, a strategy, and a mission. Today, the big difference to me is the global commitment to achieve all together and not work by silo, but collectively to find out the right solutions. That's a big change, I think, in the mindset of the people. That's my first remark. Of course, now we have the midterm measures, with the IMO, with the economic mechanism, the technical mechanism. I think that brings trust to the future. It may not accelerate the process, of innovation and so on to meet the target with the net zero in 2050, but at least it brings trust, and it will help for this global commitment with all, the shipping stakeholders to progress and invest. Invest with the incentives scheme, taxes and so on, but I think that will accelerate the number of first movers, in the market. And we start seeing a lot of, projects in that respect. So I'm confident that once, all the schemes will be set up with some accelerations.
The Tokyo edition of the GMF meeting was the 7th time that these industry group of front-runners have gathered. So you might well ask yourself, why haven't they sorted out all these problems before? But I think it's worth pointing out quite how far this conversation has actually come. And let's not forget that the problems that we were discussing in 2018 looked a lot different compared to what we are talking about today. Today, the industry is, by and large, agreeing on the fact that we must fully decarbonise shipping, and that simply wasn't the case back in 2018. Here's Lloyd's Register's Chief Executive, Nick Brown.
So we, at Lloyd's Register, we try and measure progress across 3 axes: technology readiness, commercial readiness, societal readiness. I think the first and the third, we've made significant progress. If you look back to GMF 2018, I think in Hong Kong, first one, we had very little idea of whether or not we could actually make deep sea zero carbon ships actually feasible. Yeah. And now we've got a whole raft of them under construction, and indeed we are expecting the first deep sea ammonia fueled capable, not ready, fully capable ships to be delivered, probably carrying ammonia as a cargo, which will be quite handy to actually make sure the technology works, entering the waters in 2026. We've also seen societal readiness with the new 2050 goal being very clearly outlined. What we haven't seen, and I think we sort of see this play out with recent changes in preferred fuels, or maybe a switch back to let's maybe focus on what fuel is actually available, is any scalability in blue or green fuels, or even really scalability in bio fuels. And so the limiting factor now on the industry now seems to be the commercial readiness. And what is it that we can do to create greater pools of long-term offtake agreements with greater, connectivity with those people and governments that are interested in creating infrastructure in the ports, behind the ports, to produce those fuels.
The other limiting factor, of course, is the big regulatory elephant in the room. As I mentioned at the top of this week's edition, all roads right now lead to the IMO. Shipping's green first movers, who have collectively invested billions of dollars in decarbonisation projects from zero-carbon fuel supply to wind propulsion and digital technology, well, they're going to be unlikely to move much further without a sufficiently robust regulatory framework. While discussions at the IMO to conclude policy measures capable of delivering net zero emissions across the industry by 2050 are progressing positively and getting close, we are assured, the industry is now at a tipping point when it comes to green investment. And there is a sense from many that progress is already stalling. So I think it was interesting that amid all of these discussions inside the GMF this year, that the most intensive discussion of the meeting by far was the one that involved the IMO Secretary General Arsenio Dominguez. And I asked him straight, is the industry in wait-and-see mode right now?
Something that I have noticed in the industry and that I have mentioned in the past is that we can be more proactive as a sector. Now, decarbonisation, we all hear and are aware of the challenges that exist. But we know these challenges. That's nothing new. That shipping, has different layers, different sectors within shipping itself, and we have carried out different type of regulations, taking into account the characteristics of the different type of ships. We have also introduced low-hanging fruit, or we are referring here in the GMF as low-hanging fruit, because those are technical and operational measures that can be put into place in order to start gaining even more efficiency, which is going to take us to meet some of the targets that we have set up in 2030. I continue to strive for change in the industry, and that means that we can be more proactive, particularly those that can be early movers. Yes, there continues to be requests in IMO to provide further guidance, further clarification on how we're going to achieve the goal of decarbonizing by around 2050. But let's face it, we were asked to provide a clear vision of what we're going to decarbonize, and that's what we did last year in 2023. And this is what I call on everyone to also take their steps, their actions in supporting the work of IMO, because their experience and their expertise will make our regulatory process even better. Next year, we are committed, and after the conversations, very cordial exchanges in MEPC with everybody, it's working toward finding the compromises in addressing the concerns that they have, is what gives me the confidence, or to highlight my confidence in actually meeting the challenge of finalizing the technicals and economic measures by next year and the entry into force in 2027, which of course will provide additional guidance. But it's time that the industry also recognizes that the more you are guidance for IMO, the more that we're going to provide them. But that's the more that I'm also going to call for every single stakeholder to also take the first steps, to take the actions, particularly those that have already been regulated and not all of them have been taken on board. And that would allow us to look forward in a more proactive way to introduce the changes that this industry requires in order to modernize itself, to truly be sustainable, to decarbonize, and to actually attract the younger generations, the professionals of the future that will be looking at us into what we do for them to be part of it.
Okay, so we are back with the question that I set at the beginning of this week's edition. Has shipping moved from laggard to leader, or are we stalling? For what it's worth, I went into this year's GMF feeling somewhat sceptical about the pace of change, and I left much more optimistic. Now, I grant you that the GMF is not a representative body of the wider shipping industry, but these first movers are arguably a powerful movement now, and like it or not, they set the tone and the pace. We have made progress, and as the GMF president, Jan Dieleman, put it, these developments teach us one thing, that change happens through small steps taken by many. So I'm going to leave the last word this week to the Chief Executive of the GMF, Johanna Christensen, who I think sums up the feeling in the room very well.
I can only speak for the ones that I know and encounter in our work, and I don't see them stalling. I see them working on, as you say, very difficult details, including some of the topics that are on the agenda here today, which are around the commercial arrangements to close the cost gap, right? And all the people here in the room know that policy will, even in the best case scenario, will only cover part of that cost gap, and that there need to be commercial arrangements that cover the rest, and that there needs to be some kind of way in which we share some of that risk, some of that cost, and hopefully also the upside in due course. And those are super difficult conversations, but they're absolutely at the nub of what conversations are about right now. And so I don't perceive that as stalling. I see that as taking on the difficult next steps. And will they be made easier by an outcome, a supportive outcome at the IMO next year? Absolutely. Is more action going to be unlocked by a good outcome at the IMO next year? Absolutely. But in the meantime, I can only say that certainly many of those that we work with are continuing their work, are continuing to explore the different ways, taking the next steps in the transition. And I would encourage everybody else to do the same.
That's where we're going to end it this week. I've only reflected a fraction of the conversations happening both inside the GMF and out of it, and I suspect that many of those who attended alongside me will have come away with different conclusions, such as the broad church and the nature of debate within the GMF. But I do think it's an interesting progress report, and I think it offers a useful window into the thinking behind some of the trends that we're talking about on this podcast regularly. So, a big thank you to everybody who spoke to me outside of the closed-door sessions. Thank you to Johanna, Arsenio, Iman, Carrie, Nick, Mathieu and Laura. And thank you for listening. We will be back next week with more. But for now, goodbye.